Well, the PPTs, we're trying to find it. I'd like to also thank Professor Ren Yuan and everyone for being here this afternoon. You know, even though this is probably fifth or sixth time that we've had this session, it's always exciting to talk about issues that are old, new, and particularly I think with regard to China's model of urbanization, it's really in some sense is the critical transition point, a crossroad. I think I'd like to start out taking advantage of being the first to really looking back when Professor Ren Yuan said, you know, he has another 30 years to study China's urbanization. Professor, I don't have that much time left. So I'm going to look back and also thinking about what can we learn from China's model of urbanization. For other countries that are urbanizing behind China, particularly in Africa, where urbanization is accelerating very rapidly. There are different ways of defining, characterizing, dissecting China's model, but I think overall there's more attention focused on China, more interest, and probably more critical view of China. So in some ways, I think the question I pose for myself is, has China's model run its course already? Or is it running out of steam? If it's running out of steam, and now we're talking about new model of China's urbanization, what can we learn from the old model or the transitional model? I think my way of characterizing China's model is actually very simple. It is a simple model, but it's trying to denote the complexity. So I use the letter S and using 6 S's to describe this. At the very top, you have this notion of state steering. You know, some would say, you know, the state is dominant, it drives urbanization, but I like to use this word in English, steering. I think in the Chinese translation, sometimes it's hard to find exactly what that means, you know, in translated Chinese term. I think the conference has done a very nice job to use the word 操控, but I like to think about it as also 引领, you know, guiding. So the state is in front of urbanization as opposed to be driving it from behind, okay? So with the state driving or steering urbanization, you would expect the process has been very rapid and the scale has been very large. At the same time, if the process is fast, the scale is large, and then you would expect in the lower right corner a certain set of outcomes that are very controversial. You know, the one level, you have a wide spread of urban landscape, and I'll talk about a little bit how that manifests itself. And also, you have this notion of Chinese urbanization being very shallow. It's not deep enough. And these are actually a concept from Chinese scholars. I would just borrow that concept. And to think about this model, you can actually talk about a variety of very prominent issues about growth, inequality, governance, inclusion within this 6S framework. I'm going to go through this very briefly. With regard to state steering, instead of thinking about the state as the centric, most important player, I'd like to think about state as one of the important players. It has to contend and harness global capital, bring that into the cities, and build the cities with the private sector, with non-state actors. And the role of the state in steering urbanization, if you look at over the last 30 years, is actually very differentiated. It is spatially diffused, and also at the same time contingent on and by other forces, such as global capital, such as entrepreneurship, and other kinds of forces. And the state role has shifted over time. It affects different cities differently. There are different stages of development. We think about Shenzhen and Shanghai. They're very different cities, even though their underlying process may appear on the surface very similar. With regard to speed and scale, this is very familiar to all of you. I won't go into detail. is the fastest urbanizing country in history. And the scale is also historically unprecedented. There are different ways of looking at that. I think you all know the comparative statistics. I won't go into it. I think most importantly, with regard to speed, to spread and shallow, you can think about spreading in three ways. Urbanization stretches beyond traditional administrative boundaries. The cities occupy more land at the expense of the loss of agricultural land, and also leading to the formation of city regions or city clusters. A lot of that is because of the spread force. The urbanization also spreads from the major coastal cities, increasing to medium-sized to smaller cities across from the east, central, and going west. And the spreading mechanism is largely the extended build-up of physical transport infrastructure, connecting the cities to the cities around it, and connecting multiple cities to a national framework. But then shallow urbanization, I see it has two negative effects on the migrant workers. On the one hand, we all know about the barrier of hukou, which disadvantages migrant workers, denies them of many of the benefits associated with the hukou residents, but also we have to think about that in both emotional and identity terms. It prevents millions, hundreds of million migrant workers from being fully taking their roots down in the cities. So they are impermanent in the sense of being city dwellers. Now, so this slide just compares very briefly what we think are about strength of the Chinese model and pitted them against the weaknesses. In some ways, the strengths are very obvious, almost very predictable. First, though, the overall rapid economic growth, wealth creation, and also poverty alleviation. So in that sense, I think the Chinese model is very distinctive. The World Bank and many others have talked about hundreds of millions of people being lifted out of poverty. So we attribute that to urbanization. A rapidly growing middle class, a huge disposable income, somewhat undertapped, but increasingly point to the future of the new urbanization. How do we unleash more of the consumer power with more and more of the people moving into the cities, beginning to climb the social economic ladder? I talk about large-scale infrastructure, and also global openness and integration. How global capital is being localized or domesticated by the local government to work with other domestic capital and other kinds of forces. So if you go back here, on the weaknesses side, I list more of the weaknesses or the liabilities. So in some ways, we're seeing the model at risk, right? Again, I think the key to think about the strength versus the weaknesses is the weaknesses were almost built into the model from the very beginning. When the central government created Shenzhen, the special economic zones, it already sowed the seeds of planned spatial inequality. As that policy began to be expanded to other cities, we begin to see spatial inequalities become more and more complex, involve more and more of the cities, and the disparities between different levels of development began to multiply. We're all very much aware about the environmental degradation of the cities, so urbanization has been achieved at tremendous expense to the environment. Inequalities, loss of agricultural land, and so on and so forth. My last slide is to say, well, given the strengths and weaknesses, because when you have rapid growth, it tends to highlight and accentuate the strength because everybody is happy, all the mayors, the national government seeing all the GDP growth numbers. But when the growth begins to slow down, when the weaknesses begin to outweigh the strength, it allows us an opportunity to see the gritty, the gloomy side of building up Chinese cities to be glamorous, to be grandeur. So given all the weaknesses that we're seeing manifest themselves more strikingly, then we should be asking the question, what can China teach? What can China instruct about other developing countries? Is China truly exceptional? If it is exceptional in terms of the driving forces, but the underlying process and the outcomes of urbanization, are they generalizable? outcomes, characteristics that can extend to other countries. So this helps me thinking about the sources of looking from the Chinese side to what other countries in terms of what can be learned. But if it is a very strong state, but can also steer the urbanization, in other words, there's the hard power of the state, but there's also the soft power of the state in steering urbanization. Then we look from the other side, we say, well, if you don't have that kind of a state in another urbanizing country, maybe it's not a feasible strategy, or it cannot really be replicated. With regard to the spreading and the shallowing of urbanization, well, we can also ask the question, if migration in other countries like India, for example, where the people have sold their land, completely settled in the cities, which will be very different from what we're seeing in China, where millions of migrants are really not fully settled in the cities when they get to their 40, 50 years old. Many of them are going back to the countryside. They flow back and forth. Some of them leave families behind. They send money home, but they're not completely urbanized in the sense of the human experience of urbanization that corresponds to the physical expansion of the urban footprint. So there's a mismatch. There's a decoupling between the spatial expansion of the cities, or place-oriented urbanization, as opposed to people-oriented urbanization in terms of the deepening of the human experience. Harnessing global capital, I think China has demonstrated that it has done that pretty well, right? Many of the cities, or almost all of the cities, are factory cities. They were built up to make things and sell to the world. Many other countries like India, the countries like Laos and Cambodia, for example, are beginning to build special economic zones. They're learning from China already because their labor costs about half or a third of China's labor costs, which has been going up 20%, 15% for the last 3-4 years. Infrastructure build-up. I think that's potentially a very positive lesson for other countries to think about importance of connecting the cities, right? To bring jobs to people, to bring materials between cities, and to bring the products to world markets. Environmental degradation, definitely a no for other countries. Learning the lessons that China has taught in terms of degrading the environment, probably to the point where it's going to cost a lot more to redress the environmental degradation. And finally, plan special economic zones. If other countries are learning what China has been doing, be careful. Don't overdo it. China has done that to the extreme. You have hundreds and thousands of special economic zones at all different levels of the government. Other countries that have, India, for example, have many of them, Ratula have told me, on the planning board, but very difficult to implement them because the land ownership issue is very different from China. I think with this PowerPoint, I'd like to leave it as a kind of question for others to also help me think about whether China's model of urbanization is finally now getting to the point where we should focus much more on the critical scrutiny of what we have learned from it and what other countries can learn to avoid. Perhaps what China has done in some ways may have to adapt, modify some elements of that model to their national, to their local conditions, and do better than what China has done. Thank you.